Here we go. We're on the studio and we're with Tony. I apologize, everybody. We now have connection. Okay.
Yeah, it just wasn't ringing this end. I had to ring into you.
Okay, that's pretty funny. Okay, we're live now on air. Everybody, this is Susan Lindauer in the Covert Report. I apologize for this. We're talking about Fran Anderson, who is a hero of the investigative journalism in the alternative media. And I also want to start the show with a reference to Donald Trump and the golden shower meme, the fake news report, which was introduced by British intelligence. Okay. Now, Fran Anderson would have loved this story because she was the type of journalist who would cut straight down and rip this thing to shreds, wouldn't she?
She certainly would, Susan. I mean, we've been seeing absolutely farcical reporting of this. Oh, such and such a MI6 guy has gone into hiding. Well, of course, he's not. MI6 are totally...
Christopher Steele is his name.
That's
Christopher
right.
Steele. Let's not hide his identity because he's a former spook. He's got to be exposed, and he deserves a beating right now.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not saying whether or not there's any truth to this, but the point is there's been this whole story created around it, which is to do with, this guy is under threat from Russia. And the background to this, of course, is we've got all the revelations, so-called revelations last week. We've got to be, that Russia has got all this dirt on Donald Trump and they may be releasing it. Well, of course, the people who will be releasing it won't be Russia. It'll be the people that Donald Trump booted.
Well, that's right. And what we found was that it was a complete, utter fabrication. This guy Christopher Steele had made up had received a report and passed it. He's British intelligence, passed it off to a former British ambassador who we don't know his name. I don't know that person, the British ambassador's name. Gave it to John McCain. John McCain gave it to enemies of Donald Trump, knowing that they would broadcast it. The problem was the entire dossier was completely false. It targeted one of Trump's. It included a target of one of Trump's top aides in his corporation, the Trump Corporation, who Trump said, "Give me your passport." The guy brings out his passport. The guy had never been to the country that was in question. He'd never even been there. He was not traveling out of the United States at the time this alleged meeting was supposed to have happened. And therefore they said, "Oh, gosh, I guess it must be a different man by the same name." No, it was completely fabricated. They made up a story that Donald Trump had hated Obama so much that he did a golden shower on prostitutes in a Russian hotel that had slept on a bed. He paid them to, do whatever on a bed that Obama had allegedly slept in at this hotel. Well, it's just so bizarre and so crazy. I will tell you, I think, Tony, that Britain has seriously damaged its relationship to Donald Trump for the future. I think that Nigel Farage he totally Trump's with Nigel Farage, and they will continue to have a very strong relationship because Trump is very loyal. But when you turn around and screw Trump, he does not forget. And I think the British have made a terrible mistake.
Well, okay, look, let's be careful here because it's not the British, it's the British criminal elite, and they are on the back foot here as well. What with Brexit coming along, I mean, we've got a government with Theresa May in charge. She's got this she's trying to portray this image of kind of Mother Teresa, I think it's important that politicians can talk about their faith in God and the Bible, and yet all the time what she's doing is she's destroying public services. She's taking money away from disabled people so that they're basically becoming either housebound or evicted from their homes. The same happening with the poorest, the unemployed, making them dependent on government subsidies even when they've got full-time jobs. So what she's doing is totally the opposite. So she's part of the whole this is an epic, long program of discrediting people of faith. But, you've got that at the forefront. But of course, this is the distraction show away from where it really happens, which is mostly amongst the banking elites, the criminal elites, the people that were behind the greatest heist in history, where Gordon Brown said, "Oh, I'm saving the world by bailing out the banks in the city," whereas actually what he was doing was he was condemning future generations to pay back an unpayable debt, rather like the debt that's been stored up in the United States, kind of spreading that around Europe. But I mean, let's not lose sight of Fran, because you and I had a really good interview. Well, you interviewed the pair of us, didn't you, back just before the Brexit vote? And I mean, she was very clear about much of what's going on in the world, which is that, I mean, this Jonathan Steele guy, he's at ex-MI6, so he's at one step removed, so it's got the sort of deniability factor. And also, there isn't any real credibility to what he's saying. There's no real proper evidence for it. A bit like the accusations of the Russians hacking the Democratic Party in the run-up to the presidential elections. The fake news meme, I think, is a real blowback, Susan, because everybody now is thinking, hang on, this thing they're putting on the mainstream news, that's fake news. Getting the idea of fake news out there is I think, preparing everybody in a way for the big lies to come, the 9/11s to come in the future, the 7/7 bombings to come in the future, and all of the nonsense that's going to be thrown at the public as an excuse to take away their civil liberties. Things like the coming crash. Goodness knows when that'll be. But certainly Europe can't survive very long. I don't know if you've seen it, but Pepe Escobar's done a fantastic article about all this, looking to 2017 into the future. It's called Shadow Play. He started his column again in the Asia Times, and he's one of the sharpest commentators in the world, pointing the finger at Henry Kissinger as trying desperately to maneuver the Trump administration, because of course Kissinger will be advising Trump. It looks pretty clear that's going to be happening, and it's already happening. That he wants a bit of a rapprochement with Russia, so that Kissinger can then start to have a go at China. But it might be the other way round. It's always divide and rule with Kissinger. You're going to be being.
Kissinger's not going to be tight with Russia, with Trump. On our side of the pond, we don't see that happening.
Don't you? I mean,
No.
I've just seen. I mean, Trump has met with him, and it looks as if. Well, maybe not, Susan. I'm not.
No, I don't think Kissinger would. Trump's met with a lot of different people, but we are expecting a rapprochement with Russia, definitely. But that's not a Kissinger thing. Kissinger has nothing to do with it.
Anyway, look, let's just talk about Fran for a minute before we get on to all the other stuff.
Yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
Fran died very sadly last year, very quickly, of cancer. She had real trouble with getting her doctor. I mean, she spoke to a lot of her friends, and of course to her while she was ill, while she was dying slowly, back in sort of September time. And she'd been to her doctor to try and get scans and stuff, because she realised she was quite seriously ill, but the doctor was arguing against it, even though her blood tests had come up indicating that there might be cancer. He said, oh, well, just that blood test on its own doesn't mean anything. I mean, we're in this situation where parts of the country which are deprived, like East London, Hackney, where Fran lived, it's a postcode lottery, basically. We've got a very good National Health Service, but if you're in an area of great deprivation where there's a lot of strain on the health service, there's overcrowding in the houses, the old houses that maybe would take one family have now been divided up into flats and are taking 3 or 4 families. The infrastructure can't cope, the hospitals can't cope with the large amount of people that are coming into accident and emergency and needing the hospital services. So Fran was, really begging for this scan, which she never got, unfortunately. But the work she was doing back in May, she did a fantastic presentation on the anthrax attacks. She was also working on a book on the anthrax attacks. And as I understand it, the police are trying to find her laptops because they've disappeared of this book, which is pretty shocking. She was getting on with a book on because, of course, the reason Fran was interested in anthrax particularly was it was used to shut down the democratic process in the United States immediately after 9/11, both for the criticism of what had happened through the media, which is a part of the democratic process, which wasn't going to be amazingly robust, but also some of the senators, congressmen who were likely to be questioning this whole sort of Homeland Security bill, which had been pre-prepared, ready to come through. And so she was really focused on, let's just have a really close look at these anthrax attacks, because they were clearly part of the 9/11 conspiracy, having been being pre-prepared, ready to shut down the immediate democratic reaction to 9/11, questioning it. So where it was likely to be questioned by the media and by politicians, the anthrax suddenly turned up on the scene just to disable that. That's a very important part that some people kind of brush over of the initial plan to bamboozle the US public, the US media, and US politicians.
Hello?
Yeah, hi.
Oh, okay. Okay, great. Yeah.
So I think, all I'm saying is, her focus on anthrax, I think, was absolutely well aimed, and interesting that, there's been quite a lot of work done in the States, but not so much over here, really, looking at that aspect of things.
Well, do you think that her activism had anything to do with the fact that they withheld treatment from her?
Really impossible to say. I know her sister put in some sort of complaint to the medical practice in Hackney where she was going. But sister unfortunately died just shortly after she did, so...
Her sister died right after she did?
Yes, that's right. Her brother also is in Los Angeles. He's a professor of, I think it's anthropology, something like that, archaeology in Los Angeles. And he came over. I met him a couple of times. There's got to be some suspicions about the way she died. I think the disappearance of her laptops at the same time. Just after she went into hospital. Very peculiar.
That is very strange. So what you're saying is that not only did she didn't just die, but when she went to the hospital, her research materials were taken out of her house.
Well, certainly that's what. Yes, I think her main computer was there, but she was doing most of her work and had all her emails, backwards and forwards emails, etc., on her laptops, and they have disappeared. Police have been informed about that. I haven't heard any more since then. But to try and do Fran justice is almost impossible because she was such a stalwart. She was actually set up the Reinvestigate 9/11 site, which is a pretty much a focus for the 9/11 truth movement in Britain. She was always part of it, but it got kind of formalised about 2008, 2009, with a few people running it and doing meetings about every couple of months in London. There was all sorts of splits with various groups that wanted it to go down a more anti-Semitic route and to start looking at things like the Holocaust, which most of us thought was just bonkers. You don't want to link it to that kind of thing because why would you want to? Let's just look at 9/11. That's all you need to do, So there were splits around 2008, 2009. But Fran was an absolute stalwart in making sure that the website was absolutely rigorous, linked to all the most credible 9/11 criticism. And once she'd done that, she kind of hunkered down and concentrated on the facts around the anthrax attacks. Now, I know I emailed you some clips of her. I don't know if you've got those handy, Susan, have you?
Yes, but it's hard to play them on our system, unfortunately. It's not such an easy thing to upload into our system. But go ahead and describe what she says. Let's talk about her anthrax research because she was very she had studied the different labs where the anthrax might have been developed, and it was very limited, very targeted. She had, anthrax and all biological and chemical weapons, even nuclear weapons, have a tracer on it, so that you can trace the source and the origins of the where it has been weaponized, and it all comes from the United States.
Yeah, that's right.
Like Bechtel Laboratories, the U.S. Army laboratories in Utah.
Yeah, I think her first, she was quite a long presentation, which you can probably link to maybe on your show page. to the YouTube.
Yes, I will. I can link it on the show page. Yes.
Yeah, and she was first of all really looking at the connections between Anthrax and the 9/11 hijackers. Apparently, a Mohammed Attar was linked in some way with that. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I could try and play it here. I'm not sure if you'll be able to hear it.
Okay, see if you can play it on your end.
I'll have a go. You have to leave me for a minute to do that, though.
Okay, you know what we'll do? We'll set that up at the break. All right.
Well, let's carry on anyway. Because Fran's, her background is fascinating. She's a very independent-minded woman, and she always managed to bring humour in with all this, which is so important, isn't it? Some people are very dour, like the Scots, very dour. This is terrible. They've just got this kind of gloomy face about everything, and it's all a little bit Presbyterian, kind of Calvinist or whatever. Well, Fran wasn't like that at all. She would always laugh and joke about absolutely everything, and it was a pleasure meeting her, exchanging ideas and information with her, and particularly phone calls, because whenever she phoned me, I never knew quite what persona she was going to put on. She would be agent this, agent that. One of the favourite ones was Agent Frazzle, that she was going to be, and she would be calling from, of course, MI6 headquarters or something, So I always got some sort of
because the surveillance in Britain is even worse than the surveillance in the United States. Everybody.
Well, I think you're probably right when it comes to CCTV. There's loads and loads of that everywhere, and nobody really knows who's able to monitor it and watch it. Of course, whenever there's a terrorist attack or a police murder, execution like there was a couple of weeks ago up near Huddersfield here, we're always told, there's no CCTV, even though the cameras, you can see them pointing at the scene of the whatever. And it's the same with Jean-Charles de Menezes, who was executed on the London Underground just after the 7/7 attacks. The 7/7 attacks themselves, we were showing pictures of the so-called bombers coming to London at Luton, on their way, but absolutely nothing putting them on the trains that they were supposed to be on. No CCTV of that at all. It all disappeared. Into this black hole. So it's a very, it's used to manipulate, the CCTV business. And she was very much aware of that. Fran was absolutely spot on with picking all this stuff up. But anyway, just the lovely, laughy, jokey attitude. It would be the Pentagon. I'd be the Pentagon. Is that the Pentagon? She'd say, is that the Pentagon? So it was always able to do it with humour, and of course satire as well, taking the mickey out of current events. There'd be something like, say, if there'd been some kind of attack somewhere in the world, she'd be phoning me up ostensibly to say, oh yeah, the attack went really well, this kind of thing, So it was always laughing and joking and just literally satirising, lampooning the ridiculous stories that were being told in the fake news mainstream media. And that was a great fun part of just knowing her. She'd come originally, her family was Scottish background. Her mother had worked in the intelligence services during World War II. And she's still alive in her 80s, and she was a very fascinating woman, but she would never ever say anything about what she did. Over years and years, her and her sister only managed to get a very tiny amount out of her mum. Apparently, she was working in some kind of like typing pool for the intelligence services right through the war. And knew quite a lot, and she'd quite often raise her eyebrows about this and that. But she, like many people who were in that world, they take their secrets to their grave, which is a great pity because, of course, there was a lot of dodgy stuff that was going on.
It was a tremendous wealth of knowledge of the real history of World War II that was lost because they did that. Yeah. I mean, I can see that during the war itself, the secrecy would have been paramount for their survival and for the victory in the war. But after the war, 10 years, let's pick a number, 10 years after the war, all of that stuff should have been released. It would have been very valuable.
Definitely. In fact, a lot of the research I've done has been around, and actually Fran was part of this. She helped with a lot of this because she was based full time in London. I was able to say, can you go and check this out? And she would usually come back after a few days, sometimes even with interviews for me. She'd send down the line, like recorded interviews. that sort of thing. So she was a really, really valuable contact in London, as well as a good close friend. But we worked on something called Operation James Bond. Now, have you come across that?
I'm sorry?
Operation James Bond.
No, I have not come across that.
Okay, because this is a real can of worms, and I would recommend anybody, particularly ex-military people, to get hold of this book. As I understand, it's not been published in the US, but you can get it. You can buy it on places like bookfinder.com or these various online book services and get it shipped over cheaply from Britain and from the continent to the US. But OpJB, it's called. It's a book by a guy called Christopher Crichton. And that's not his real name because he was really worried. I never met him. But various people did. Fran also had got to know people that knew him. But he was trained in World War II as a commando down at Hayling Island to do.
Okay, everyone, we're coming back. We'll come back after the break. This is Tony Gosling. Hey everybody, welcome back to the Covert Report. We're talking today with Tony Gosling about Fran Anderson, who was an amazing researcher, one of 9/11's most loyal researchers coming to us from Great Britain. And Tony has some MP3 files that we'd like to try to play. Tony, I'm going to let you go ahead and start with the first one. Just watch the Skype chat in case we can't hear it. I'll give you a hint. I'll give you a nudge. But go ahead and try to play the first one.
Let's have a look at the 9/11 hijacker connection. The Centre for Civilian Biodefence Strategies examined this, and they've come across this fact that the 9/11 hijacker Ahmed al-Hasnawi attended a Florida hospital with a dark lesion on his leg, which was consistent with cutaneous anthrax. So that's not proof, but it's a possibility of a link between one of the hijackers and anthrax. And some of the 9/11 hijackers actually attended a Florida flight school, which was very near one of the workplaces, the American media workplace, which had one of the first victims of the anthrax attacks. So when we look at Mohammed Atta, this is very interesting. He's the 9/11 lead hijacker, supposedly. In June 2000, he went into the USDA, US Department of Agriculture, and asked for a loan for crop dusting equipment. And he made it quite obvious who he was. He brought attention onto himself almost deliberately. He was a very angry person, and he was shouting a lot. He said, "Make sure you spelt my name right." He even pointed to a picture of the Twin Towers that was behind the woman's desk and said, "They're coming down." He even talked about how he admired Osama bin Laden and how he wanted to learn to fly. So why was he so keen to draw attention onto himself? I mean, it's a bit strange, isn't it? Because surely if he was one of the culprits, the least thing he wants to do is bring attention to himself. The 9/11 Commission totally ignored this particular incident. So in February 2002, Colin Powell makes the case for war with Iraq by holding up a simulated test tube of anthrax spores. So that's him making the case for war and saying Iraq was the culprit for the 9/11 anthrax attacks. Well, the first theory of the FBI starts unravelling because, well, for a start, ABC News keeps reporting that Fort Detrick is stating that Amerifrax contains bentonite. Bentonite, they say, is to do with the Iraq biowarfare programme. Now, bentonite was in the Iraq biowarfare programme, but that had been discontinued well before 2001. And, however, in 2007, the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology actually proved that there was no bentonite in the spores. So Amerifrax was not cause, the culprit was not Iraq. The FBI were forced to admit that 9/11 anthrax had to have come from a US bio-warfare laboratory because what you add to the anthrax spores is its DNA, is its signature, and it gives you a clue where the origin of the spores came from. A silicone tin signature was discovered in the 9/11 anthrax spores, and that has long been used by US laboratories. So it's quite clear that the FBI did not follow up the standard investigation procedure. They were trying to get the facts to fit a predetermined theory that Iraq was the culprit and Al-Qaeda was the culprit.
Okay, that's the first clip from Fran there, and of course, what Scott Ritter said at the time was exactly the same. That the intelligence was being fitted around the policy. There was no actual, real intelligence work going on. As we all know now, of course, echoes with the Iraq invasion and weapons of mass destruction, echoes with the attempt to invade Syria with the Ghouta chemical weapons attack. The idea was that the intelligence services are just there to assemble an excuse for war.
Absolutely, and I would love to have you play the others. Our chat room is very excited about this. Please play the second one and the third one too.
Okay, I'll just by way of a bit of an introduction. One of the big things in the contradictions in the story, and of course we've had similar things with the just over the last week with the Russian hacking, so-called Russian hacking story as well. Great contradictions where the whole premise of the story suddenly shifts and nobody's supposed to notice. Is the idea of the anthrax attacker being a lone nut. So Fran had a good look at that one too.
Between September 2001 to 2003, the media link Iraq and Al-Qaeda to the anthrax attacks over 500 times. And they all quote from the same unnamed intelligence source. How convenient, and they don't even question this source. And they're hoping to repeat it enough times people are going to believe it. When the ABC news reporter Brian Ross was confronted about spreading false connections between Iraq and anthrax letters, he just brushed it off as an inconsequential error. But I don't think Iraqi citizens will think it was an inconsequential error. So the second theory that the FBI decided to construct, they said, well, it has to be a known individual that created the anthrax spores. And they claimed that you could do it for as little as $2,500 using readily available laboratory equipment from various stores. However, this was proved to be absolutely ridiculous because the Amerithrax is an aerosol form which demands very sophisticated, very advanced knowledge, training and equipment. You could not buy it from any department store and cobble together some kind of way of constructing this. So the first suspects that they picked on were some doctors. Perry, as you can see, they've been listed here. Stephen Hatfield in particular sued for $5.8 million in damages in once. They were really desperate to find a lone person that they could scapegoat for this. The FBI and the Bush administration, interestingly enough at this time, drop all mention of Amerithrax linked to the 9/11 hijackers. Why? Because it didn't fit the lone nut theory anymore, and yet it was an important clue in the investigation, but they drop it as soon as it didn't fit their pet theory. So the scapegoat they picked on was Dr. Bruce Ivins, because he had a little bit of mental instability, supposedly. He was the sole suspect, and he worked at Fort Detrick in Maryland, which is the USAMRID, US Army Military Research and Investigation Department. And he supposedly kills himself with an overdose of codeine and Tylenol in August 2008. And that's convenient for the FBI because they closed the case. February the 19th, 2010, they closed the case on who did the 9/11 anthrax attacks. And they never had to prove their case in court. Very convenient. So let's go back to the actual anthrax spores of 9/11. They're the Ames strain, and in nature it was isolated from a cow in Texas in 1980, and it was sent to USAMRIID, that's Fort Detrick, and to 15 other US laboratories in 3 other countries. You've got at least 4 variants of the Ames strain. The 9/11 Ames strain is a clue as to, where it came from, where it originated, who the suspects might be. It's highly toxic, it's very lethal, it's concentrated, and it's very, very rare. The spores differ all from the Ames strain. The senator's letters had an extra fine powder that literally just floats out the envelope. Not like that. That's talcum powder. If that was anthrax, that would have gone spreading all over this building, and it would be contaminated, and we would have to take ciprofloxacin or something.
Yeah, so that's Fran's forensic look at the ever-changing tale of the supposed origins of the anthrax attacks.
Now, this is significant because, in the first clip, I wanted to give you a chance to play this one too, because we see that in both clips, they change the story. First, they try to blame it. This is why I didn't want to interrupt the first clip before it went to the second one. Notice that in the first clip, they try to attach anthrax to Muhammad Atta, which means that it has to be part of a large conspiracy. Then they try to change the story and say that it's entirely unrelated to Muhammad Atta, and they try to get it connected to Fort Detrick, and they realize they're trapped by this signature, and they have to find somebody inside the establishment, though this person would have no motive or no motive of any kind for doing it, except that they're mentally unstable, supposedly mentally unstable. This person, the doctor in question at Fort Detrick, had a history of depression. He had suffered depression in the past. He was a brilliant researcher, had never affected his capability, never impacted his capability to do his job. He was married happily with family, children, and it was of course devastating to be under public scrutiny by the FBI, and it was very damaging to his reputation with his colleagues. However, as Fran noted, the first person who had been attacked, he was actually the second target of the FBI, and the first person had already sued and was winning damages, and the whole scientific research community was already suspicious of the propensity to change this story and to try to attach blame somewhere and to just kind of throw it out. So even now, years later, this man's colleagues have continued to defend him and have said, we don't believe anything about this. We don't even think this was a suicide. This may have been an accidental overdose, but that is the most that his colleagues are willing to say. I live in the area near I live in Maryland, and Fort Detrick and Fort Meade are 20 miles away from me, and so I'm more. That's more local news, is that locally nobody believes the story, but that Fran is quite accurate in everything she's saying.
Yeah, I mean, she was pretty forensic in a lot of her work, and I think the other thing, as I've said before, is she was really pointing her research in the right direction, instinctively knowing that there was a conspiracy at September 11th attacks, and part of that conspiracy was to paralyze the normal reaction to any kind of event, to analyze it, to pull it apart, and to attempt to come up with some kind of solution to it and to deal with it. Because the thing is that the part of the conspiracy was that they'd already come up with how they wanted the US government to react to it, the US media to react to it, and they didn't want anyone having any ideas for themselves about, well, we want to do it this way or we want to do it that way. She was quite clear, Susan, that the real culprits, and she puts it forward as a hypothesis, but I know this was her view, that it was the deep state which was behind it, because we know there's a lot of talk about Trump and Hillary Clinton. And of course Obama and all this change around at the White House, but the deep state sits there embedded and is much more of a immovable object. The permanent government, if you want, the people who have got a big sway over policy, and it seems are able, for example, to even bamboozle the new president into backtracking on his claims about whether it's Russia that's done the hacking, because of course on Wednesday he said, well, actually it was Russia. It looks the other thing about all this.
He hasn't exactly said that. He said that there's hacking coming from a lot of different sources.
Definitely hinting in that direction, right? That maybe it was the Russians. So it looks as if he's been bamboozled. The other thing, of course, Susan, which is
he's not. I have to warn you that what's happening in Britain is that you guys may be repeating that there's been a new and everybody needs to watch out for this, because the corporate media here is wrestling with the Washington Post and ABC News have a problem. And that is that Trump is refusing to go along with their story. So what they're doing is they're digging through all of his comments, and any tiny little deviation, they are grabbing hold of that and saying, "Oh, Trump now acknowledges it." No, he did not. I pardon me, I beg to disagree. What he said was that he has issued a demand to his intelligence people that they will look at cyber security across the board and do a major report on the total issue of cybersecurity. And he acknowledges that there is some Russian hacking, but there's also Chinese hacking, and there's British hacking, and it's coming from all over. That is not saying that he believes that the Russian hackers hacked into the DNC. It's saying that there are Russian hackers in the planet working today, but he also specifies China is involved in major hacking. So what he's talking about is something parallel, which is smart, which acknowledges that there is a greater problem of cyber hacking into government. But that is not saying that he admitted that the Russians hacked into the DNC, because he has never said that. But what's happening is the Washington Post is trying to grab anything they can, and they're taking his statements and they're twisting it around, trying to reposition that, oh, he's backing off. He agrees with us now. No, he did not. And he's not the kind of man who I think is going to back off. I think that really what I said at the very beginning of the show, that Britain and Ukraine are going to find out that they're in a world of hurt over this. And I think that Theresa May is going to be thanking her lucky stars that she's got Nigel Farage to intercede with Trump, and Trump is going to be making his support for Britain conditional on Theresa May's support for Nigel Farage. I think that not the big winner on your side of the pond will be Nigel Farage, who will be the one person who is still considered loyal to Trump and who has his trust.
Yes, but Nigel Farage has absolutely no power. He's basically a kind of Punch and Judy media character. He's been a big part of the Brexit vote, which is
yes, indeed.
But actually power in Britain he has virtually none at all. Certainly doesn't have any of the control.
Well, he's going to have more power now, because he's going to be the voice for Brexit and the voice that stood with Donald Trump. And power is where Donald Trump will give him the power, and he will be elevated because after this stunt, I can tell you, Tony, Donald Trump is not going to forgive British intelligence. You can say all you can pray, you can.
Look,
let me just say this.
We don't forgive them either.
The British intelligence is going to pay for this. They can say that Jonathan Steele is ex-MI6. He's former intelligence. The fact is that British intelligence, that once a spook, always a spook, and Trump understands that. And British and a former MI6 Jonathan Steele, handed this off to a former British ambassador who gave it to Donald Trump's biggest enemy.
I know. You've said this before. But, I mean, we're in a situation here where we don't trust MI6 at all anyway. We've had all the lies about weapons of mass destruction. We've had a whole history of empire and a whole history of lies where most of the rest of the world knows that MI6 has been behind things like Operation Gladio, although we don't talk about it here in Britain. So I don't think there's anything really new about, casting aspersions on MI6. They were, for example, under the tutelage of a certain Ed Miliband, the brother of the former Labour leader.
But now you have attacked a president of the United States.
Well, I know.
Now has one of the United States and British alliance has been very precious to Britain most of all. And I know that, Britain sees itself as being very important in the world, but in terms of a European alliance, that was a mistake. Have you covered
this spy scandal from last weekend at all with this guy Shai Massot, who was plotting as an Israeli senior political attaché, who was plotting to take down a defence minister in the British cabinet? Have you covered that?
Let's talk about that right now.
Pretty amazing stuff, actually. It's been called Israelgate. It was released by Al Jazeera's investigations unit, which is interesting because, of course, Qatar has just done this deal with Rosneft, the Russians, and Doha TV seems to be where it's at the moment, because they've done a journalistic sting operation in London where they've been doing secret recordings and sending people in saying that they're Labour Party members when they're not, getting the Israelis to sort of come out on hidden cameras to say what they're up to. Now, this guy, Shai Massot, the Israeli embassy have said he's nothing to do. He's only a very junior guy. Actually, his business cards say he's a senior political officer or attaché to the embassy. And he was caught on camera saying that he wants that he's got £1 million slush fund and that he wants to use it to help take down the Alan Duncan, who's one of the defence minister, who's a junior defence minister under Boris Johnson at the Ministry of Defence. Now, this was quite an amazing revelation last weekend. The Israelis deported the guy and said, "Oh, that's an end to it." But of course, it isn't. And on my radio show last night, we had Craig Murray, the former ambassador to Uzbekistan, talking about the golden chains of Israel and how nobody in the British media is allowed to criticise Israel, and if they do, they lose their job. There's this. It was only Al Jazeera did it, and the only reason that the London media even covered it was because they couldn't totally ignore it. So they did a little bit on the story. But this is absolutely extraordinary that none of the British media can do such sting operations. It has to come from the Gulf states, a crew come over to do this investigation in London. The other thing, of course, is that Andrew Parker, who's the Director General of MI5, our version of the FBI, Andrew Nosy Parker, we call him, he didn't do anything, didn't know anything about this, and they've not come out with any statement about whether it's okay for the Israelis to be having great slush funds in their embassy, unofficial staff who are not on the diplomatic list, who are there plotting to take down government ministers. Unbelievable story, but I don't know.
Oh, it's very dangerous. We're in a situation of these are coups. They're trying to take down the government.
But all that's happened is this guy has made statements, Alan Duncan, about critical of the Israeli settlement program. That's it. And so the Israelis are now saying that we're going to get this guy kicked out of the government. I thought it was an amazing bit of work by Al Jazeera, and it just shows how hopeless the London media is when it's not able to do such things. Now, none of these media are perfect. We know that, the Daily Mail, the Guardian, but every now and again they come up with something good. And, of course, it's much easier to be highly critical, particularly of Israel, when you're not actually based in London, because the Israeli lobby have done a very good job of just completely annihilating any kind of real criticism. Max Kaiser, from Russia Today, I remember him saying, we had a contract with the BBC. He said there was only one rule: we couldn't criticise Israel.
Yeah, you can't criticize Israel. And there's going to be, and Trump is going to do the same thing. He's going to be very hard. He's going to be very protective of Israel. I think that we have anticipated that. It may be I'm coming to see that it may be the cost or the price of his support for Russia and his refusal to support the jihadists in Syria is that he feels that he has to balance that out with stalwart, unflinching support for Jerusalem, for the embassy in Jerusalem, because he's trying to say, look, Israel, you don't have to be afraid of a U.S. alliance with Russia, because we're going to be so protective of Israel that it'll be like this ironclad wall, in Trump's vision, that wall of protection around Israel will give him what he needs to be able to do all the good things, which is to cut off the money, the arms, the training for the Syrian rebels that are fighting against Assad in this ridiculous war, and to cut off, to completely reverse the tacit support for the Libyan rebels in Darna and Tripoli.
But the point here is it's Israel's war that's being fought out there. That is the whole.
So he's trying to. I know, but he's trying to tell them that you don't have to be afraid of us, of our friendship with Russia, and that may be the only thing that he can do.
Well, listen, I've got a question for you, Susan, if you don't mind, and that is looking at all these people in Trump's cabinet, which will start its operations in a week's time. Is we've got Rex Tillerson, Mike Pompeo, Mad Dog James Mattis, all of whom have been saying making anti-Russia statements. I mean, Mattis is saying that Russia is doing its best to break up NATO. I would say, actually, things like the attempted coup in Turkey is a good way of breaking up NATO. If one of your NATO colleagues tries to conduct a coup within your country, that's going to help break up the alliance, and also trying to get the Germans to have an economic war, psychological war, and possibly a real war with moving all these tanks into eastern Germany is another way of trying to break up the alliance. But what do you make of the contradictions there?
It's important for everyone to really, really get this. Before the break, we were talking about, you asked a very important question. What do I think will happen with Trump? And I want to go back to Fran Anderson, but I also want to answer this question with a teaser back at you guys. Okay. Ukraine has been responsible. We all know the big fight between Ukraine and Russia, and Ukraine has been the source of a lot of the bad intelligence on Trump. They are blamed for the bad intelligence on Trump. Well, I will tell you that, and while everyone's trying to say, oh, Russia tried to help Trump get elected, well, Ukraine tried to help Hillary Clinton get elected, and Trump knows it. Apparently now, I will answer your question, Tony, this way. The Ukrainians sent a delegation to New York that waited for several weeks in the cold and the rain, trying to get meetings with the Trump organization, and they were shut out entirely, could not even get in the door. Trump refused to meet the high-ranking Ukrainian delegation. They are now trying to spend a fortune in lobbying fees, trying to find anybody who can represent them in Washington, who will be able to put their story and their position in front of Donald Trump. And no one, now this is Washington, D.C., guys, no one is taking their money. Everybody's like, oh no, we see the writing on the wall. We do not want to be representing Ukraine against Trump, because Trump is going to bite it. Trump's already put it out. They're done. It was a mistake. They chose the wrong side, but they didn't just choose the wrong side by wishing Hillary could get elected. They have actively sabotaged him. And I guarantee you that what's happened with the British intelligence will now be very much like what's happened with the Ukrainians. There's going to be a backlash. And next week we're going to see that Trump will stay true to his word. I truly believe it. And Trump will de-escalate the conflict in on the eastern side of in Eastern Europe. I'll bet that he pulls the forces out of Lithuania. Obama has just deployed forces into Lithuania.
Yeah.
I will bet that one of Trump's first moves will be to relocate those people away.
Well,
on the other hand, the aircraft carriers are now there's actually a line of all the aircraft carriers have been banked, and they've been pulled into harbor, and the reason is that there is copper wiring, which apparently the Russians have declared that they could manipulate. That kind of work will continue. They're now going to be upgraded from copper wiring to high grade fiber optic wiring, which the Russians specifically cannot manipulate. That will continue, but the Lithuanian forces thing that will be drawn down. I'll bet you. And Ukraine has made a fatal mistake. There will never be a day when Trump will defend Ukraine against Russia. It will not happen.
Okay, but why is Trump surrounding himself with people who are so critical of Russia in his cabinet, Susan? That's really my question. I mean,
these are old time military people. They're gonna do whatever their commander in chief says, and what they're saying is, yeah, we know Russia's a rival. We're always going to be tough and strong on Russia. And that's true. You know, Trump is not going to, the thing is this, the United States is a superpower, or at least we like to think we are a superpower. And I think that's the question of, I hear you kind of laughing, snickering in the background. We are not the superpower we once were, but Trump would like us to be. And Trump is not going to play second fiddle to Russia. That will never happen.
Yeah, I think
that I also believe.
A real superpower status comes with a certain amount of respect as well. It's not just about fear. And I think we're in a situation now, and we were with the British Empire as that was crumbling, where people were losing respect for you as a sort of losing respect for the empire. And you're having to work harder and harder and harder and harder and harder for everything you want to accomplish. And you end up just using, with your only option really being a military option, which is a pathetic way to behave. It just shows how little. I mean, I was looking at something, but I don't know if you've come across the Saker, the blog of the Saker. Really, I thought, fascinating bit of analysis in one of his articles. His website is based in Iceland, but I think he is an ex-US guy who's based in Russia. It's really difficult quite to work out where he's from. But he's saying a real basic analysis of the modern military in a really interesting article. He said it's called How Russia is Preparing for World War III. It was written in the middle of last year. But he says, look, he defines 21st century warfare, and it's pretty much what we've been just saying here. 80% information, 15% economic warfare, and only 5% military. So, and that I think is almost looking at that as the sort of capability that the US, the transatlantic alliance, has now. All they seem to have really left is trying to bamboozle people through the mainstream media, trying to use the economic cosh to attack a country economically, somewhere like Zimbabwe, for example, or the attempt to take down Russia using an economic warfare over the oil prices. And the military is just only a small contingent of that. But then, of course, the military is an enormous. If things escalate, the military then suddenly becomes almost 100% of what the warfare is. So, I think that's where we are with the deep state actually making a lot of these decisions along the line. And it really is going to be interesting to see how Trump copes with the deep state. How do you think he's going to manage, Susan?
Well, I think everything you're saying, I'm just nodding. Yes, every word of what you said is true. The United States has lost its credibility. We're the last ones to know that the United States is no longer respected and trusted and revered throughout the world. We're still believing that everyone loves Americans even if they hate our government, but they really don't. They really don't. And we are going to have to work harder and harder than ever before. But I think that Trump is also exactly the right antidote to that. He recognizes he's honest. And I think that the deep state hates him for it. But I think that Trump is the only way the United States could ever hope to reclaim part of its glory. We've got to shore up our domestic economy. We've got to stop being subservient. We've got to rebuild our infrastructure. We've got to have peace through strength. We have to have a strong military, but it's got to be non-interventionist. So, I think, like I said, the Trump people who are talking tough on Russia, they will always, Russia's a rival, China's a rival, but Trump's decision to collaborate with a rival in attacking the fight against ISIS and taking the fight to ISIS and fighting in the Middle East, and I think Trump is going to pull us out of the fire.
He certainly do. Yeah, it certainly sounds like that. Anyway, look, so we have a listen to this final clip from Fran now, where she talks about the deep state and 9/11.
Well, I'd like to raise the hypothesis that it could be what's called the deep state hypothesis. Since the 1990s, the CIA have been weaponizing anthrax. Between 2011 and 2012, scientific evidence shows that the silicone tin signature that was in the 9/11 anthrax, it's impossible for a single person to have manufactured that anthrax. It requires a laboratory with special expertise, not found at USAMRIID, which is Fort Detrick, but it is possible to manufacture that silicone tin signature used in the anthrax attacks on 9/11. It is possible at Dugway Laboratories, which is a US Army testing ground in Utah, and it is possible at Bethel Memorial Institute, Iowa, which works for the CIA and the US military with facilities for Amerifrax spores. The FBI ignored this. Why? Sounds like it was deliberate. And we also have evidence of CIA covert anthrax programs. A leaked report in 1999 where the CIA analysed a hypothetical anthrax attack via the mail with 2.5 grams, a maximum amount that could be posted without detection. The powder was 1 trillion spores per gram, and the senator's letters, 2 grams, and the same spore concentration. Coincidence? Also, we've got Dark Winter Exercise, June 2001, where smallpox simulated attack was to be blamed on Iraq. Then we have Project Clear Vision to assess bioagent dissemination of bomblets. And that was closed down due to suspicions its findings could be used in covert US bioweapons programs. And then we have Project Bacchus, 1999 to 2000, to see if it was possible to build a bioweapons facility with off-the-shelf equipment, which was one of the claims the FBI had made over the 9/11 anthrax attacks and was proven to be ridiculous. We also have a whistleblower from the FBI. He actually was the head of the 9/11 anthrax attacks investigation, so he's really top level. He comes out of the woodwork on April the 8th, 2015. He says the FBI investigation was understaffed, it lacked bioterror forensic skills, there were no senior microbiologists, and they gathered a staggering amount of expulsory evidence, that means showing that Ivins was completely innocent. This evidence still remains secret, so we have to ask why. Why are they keeping all this evidence secret? No fibres, no hair, no handwriting match with the letters and Dr. Bruce Ivins. Over 400 people had access to Ivins' flasks anyway, but we know that it didn't come from Fort Detrick where he worked. That's been proven.
So that's a sort of, I suppose, a pretty good explanation from Fran as to her conclusions draw her to be pointing the finger very firmly to the deep state for being behind it. You know, a bit like the whole Kennedy assassination thing, really. And these are the sorts of open secrets which are out there, you know, that the mainstream press doesn't seem to want to touch at all. And that was why it's so important, I think, that, you know, we do try and make an effort to, in this country, both activists and the police to get hold of the work she'd been doing on her laptops and try and get this book. I mean, I'm not sure how far she'd got through with it, but certainly to publish the work that she'd already done in the form of a book for Fran's legacy.
Yeah, now this is actually very important because at what point did her laptops disappear? That is significant. Was it after her death?
No,
or was
no, it was before she. I think before she died. It was when she'd gone from the hospital into the hospice. So that would be about 10 days or so before she died. It was, I mean, not everybody was regularly round at Fran's flat, and it was just one of the people who said, well, where are the laptops? And suddenly, this was after she died, the penny dropped. Well, they've disappeared, so I mean, it's not, as activists, it's not really within our ability to do a thorough investigation. Obviously, we've put together for the police a dossier of people we think might be suspects for it, but we can't kind of go around, search their flats and do the kinds of forensic work that's needed to find out where these laptops are now. So they've disappeared. There are several people that could know more. Some have been more cooperative than others in helping activists look for them. But
is it possible someone coveted her research because they'd like to eventually pass it off as their own?
No, I doubt it very much. It's much more likely that either this is just a pure, simple theft for the value of the laptops, or else that there is something a bit more suspicious where someone somewhere wanted to shut down the research that she'd done and put it into, and stop her putting it into book form, which is what we were all hoping for and expecting. I mean, one of the things she said to me long before she died is she said, I've still got work to do, Tony, and by that she was talking about getting this book out.
Yeah, on our show she talked about that. She talked about her book. She'd been working on it for a long time. Yeah,
something that best part of a year, on and off, I think. But she'd obviously pulled together, I think, one of the greatest in the world dossiers on those anthrax attacks, which is almost it's awful to say, but it's almost a forgotten aspect of it. But it won't have been forgotten by the journalists who were working on the 9/11 story immediately afterwards, who suddenly found their workplaces shut down. Some of whom obviously died because of were killed by the anthrax spores. And families of them, and the way that the democratic process was sabotaged, killed off by them, and I think it's just it's just a testament to Fran's intelligence. I mean, she was I'm not sure what degree she did, but she studied down at Sussex University near Brighton. And it's almost as if I can imagine when she's doing the anthrax presentation, one of her presentations as a university student, because she was just so forensic. And also her tone is not dour. It's quite, again, you can tell in what the clips I've been playing.
Yes.
That she finds the whole thing quite amusing, and it comes across so well. That anyone would believe this nonsense. Look at this. It's ridiculous that anyone could believe that it's a credible story. It clearly isn't. And so anyway, I think whatever with her legacy, she will definitely be remembered very fondly by us. I'd just like to see the memory also extend to thousands, tens of thousands, even maybe of others who are able to read her work in the future.
Yeah, no. I hope that you're able to get the laptops back. Is there any way to have if it was we both know it has to have been the state that did it. It has to be MI5 that did it.
No, I don't know, because it's possibly theft, Susan. It really, I really wouldn't like to say. I think there is it may be more likely it's a state. It may not, but we've had a go at finding them. And failed. So, we've done what we can, and I would suggest it might be just simply purely someone stealing them. That's the way I'm afraid sometimes these things happen, especially I know it sounds awful, but that part of East London, there's a lot of deprivation and people just need to get their hands on cash desperately. And so it might even just be that someone's stolen them without any kind of understanding or knowledge of the importance of the work that's on there. It may possibly be that. And I think we've just got to keep our ideas open until we actually get these computers back, if that ever happens.
Oh, that's really a shame. But
anyway, we've got that presentation which you're going to put up on your your show page. And I mean, we
Absolutely
did a tribute. In fact, we did a show here just after she died, really just replaying the whole of that presentation. And in a way, it's quite wonderful to have Fran. It's a bit like, you know what, I was thinking about this. Apparently one of the greatest ever Jimi Hendrix concerts, I'm not sure if you're a fan of his, was a gig he did in London, which thousands of people were at this gig. And they said it was the most amazing performance they'd ever heard him given. They was, because at the time everyone was bootlegging these concerts. And everyone was amazed that, even within a few weeks, no one was actually recording it. There was no record of it at all. And maybe that's the way it will be with Fran, that's what we've got, is we've got her wonderful presentation she did last May, and that's it.
For a whole lifetime of work. Write your works, people.
Yeah.
Write it, publish it.
The other thing to say about Fran is she came from a very sort of radical, I suppose, left-wing, almost anarchist kind of feminist background. And, so she was also very active in squatting. So that is to say,
squatting?
Squatting.
What is that?
Squatting is I don't know if you're allowed to do it in the US, but this is taking over empty buildings and living in them. And,
oh my goodness.
And so she spent a lot of her time, for example, living in Brixton, Herne Hill, places like that, in these old empty buildings, because the law in Britain is pretty good. In that if a building is empty, no one's using it, then the owner doesn't notice you're there. I mean, a lot of buildings, of course, are just used as investments and are actually kept empty because there's no real or very little tax on them.
Really?
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, well, that's the case over here. And there's all sorts of tax breaks and things, and quite a lot of people just sort of...
But housing is so expensive in London.
Yeah, so
horrifically expensive. How can they have empty buildings with so much high-priced housing, desperately in need of housing?
Look, it's because the financial situation is as it is, particularly bad now, where there's big questions over the security of the stock market. Everyone is being encouraged to take their money out of banks, aren't they, to put it in the stock market. So you're getting no interest in the bank. Zero interest, pretty much. And so the place where you put your money, where you're going to get a return through this funny money printing, quantitative easing, is the stock exchange. But anyone who's really in the know knows that could go pop at any time, so you'll lose everything. But what a lot of people have been doing since the pennies dropped, that maybe the stock market is just a temptation for you to put your money in there to get some return, but it's going to go completely. Is they put their money into property, and because at least if the stock market crashes, at least you've got something of some real solid value, which is going to be worth something after the crash. And lots and lots of people have been investing in property. In fact, most luxury housing now, or most ordinary housing even that comes onto the market in Britain, is advertised as an investment opportunity. So this is what's happening: is people with lots of spare money are maybe taking it out of the stock market and putting it into housing, and then of course everyone, ordinary people, then have to rent that housing for exorbitant amounts of money off of the landlord classes, and it's sending people into this kind of wage slavery dive, where you're working all the hours God sends, and you're hardly even able to pay the rent, electricity bills, and you've got nothing left even at the end of the week after a week of work to go to the cinema. So that's the sort of situation that we're in, where
same here, wage slavery.
Yeah, so Fran was railing against that, which was, this is a long time ago. We're talking about the 1970s and 1980s here. But she with her friends they would take over empty buildings, and then they just run them as their homes, and they go from place to place. If they got evicted from one place, then they go and hop into another one. And they had it was a sort of I suppose enlightened form of the land rights activists you see in Brazil. There's these massive things like the Movimento Sem Terra in Brazil, where you've got the landless peasants flooding into occupy land because, there is this attempt to turn cities into kind of prisons for people, where you're sitting in a box that you can't afford to live in, you're having to work, or you don't have any spare time, and you're effectively a wage slave. So, of course, people are going to start to rail against that. Oh, we don't want to do that anymore. We're not doing that. And in certain parts of the world, there are very strong movements to say, well, why should we have to pay a penny to live on the land? This is we'll build our own place, well, even if it's a shack, but we're not paying just to exist to some landlord. and I think that's a very positive attitude when people are caught up in this kind of economic cage of slave labour wages.
Well, here in the United States, there's more middle class people who are now living the way poor people used to live. Only the poor people, and it used to be that we had such a strong middle class that if you followed all the rules and did everything right and got an education and worked hard and had a good work ethic, you'd be okay, and that's gone. So those people are now taking low-paying jobs that used to be reserved for the very poor, and they're pushing the very poor right out, who don't have anything, who don't have an education, can't find any work at all. We're in a time of major economic upheaval, there's no question. Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the Covert Report. My fantastic guest today, Tony Gosling, and we're talking about Fran Anderson, one of the great British researchers of the 9/11 conspiracy and the Anthrax attack, and the timing of this interview. When Tony first asked me to cover this with him, I recognized immediately the importance of the moment, because Fran embodied all of the best parts of the research of the alternative media and the deep attention to details, the fastidious attention of analysis and the passion that motivates us to scrape far below the surface, not to be superficial at all. And Fran has been on our show with Tony before, talking about the Brexit vote last summer. And her knowledge, her capability was just she was just magical. She was so wonderful. But in a day and age when the corporate media is facile, she gave us depth. And I want to point out to everybody the commercial break. Chris Geo has come on and has notified all of you that Truth Frequency Radio is now listed as number 89 on the government hit list. Number 89, we're in the top 100 that they're going to try to crack down on with the new Facebook censorship. So
when they're saying, when we're saying that the government was under attack by the same people that carried out 9/11 during the Anthrax attacks, they think that is some sort of a danger to them, do they?
Yes, exactly. that the truth-telling, truth-saying is now because the force of the social media is so powerful that the corporate media in the United States is under severe duress. CNN is now one of the most despised internet television networks, only trumped by NBC. So you have Fox News, which is now the number one news source. You have CNN, which is at the bottom, and the whole the phony story about Hillary Clinton's inevitable landslide victory and how she was way ahead in the polls and how Trump was going to be defeated and had only an 8% chance of victory. It was complete hogwash, as we all now know, but it has the ugliness of this campaign, the acrimonious stories of this campaign, have taken their toll on the corporate media, but it's because of people like Fran Anderson that we do have the credibility, Tony, and people like you. That we do have the credibility. I mean,
I also must, and maybe you can do a link to this as well. Mention Fran was involved in something called Rad TV with Ian Henshaw. Ian Henshaw was a 9/11 author. Wrote a book called 9/11: The New Evidence, which is actually really good, and it's got loads of pictures in it. Easy, very easy to digest. Dissection of the 9/11 attacks and, all the various anomalies and lies that we've been told about those. But Fran also ran our own channel, which was called PAX VISTA TV. And on that PAX VISTA TV channel on YouTube, you'll find all sorts of fascinating interviews of people that Fran had come across. And for example, on the Brexit vote, what she did is she went out deliberately looking for dissenting voices in other parts of Europe. And you know what? She came up with some fascinating stuff from Germany, which is the German forensic dissection of Brussels, saying, well, look, they're doing this, it's killing, it's destroying the continent. And that was the one message that you never heard at all in any stage in all of the Brexit debate here in Britain, was anything from ordinary German activists, German researchers. It was entirely blotted out by the London media that there was such evidence from Germany. For example, I mean, there's other countries as well that Fran was looking at, but the German stuff was really, really interesting, very, very good. Saying, I mean, and of course now this is where we are in Germany. There's an election this year in Germany, and it looks as if the right-wing nationalists will, I wouldn't. They're definitely not a sort of Nazi fascist type nationalists. They are more the Pegida movement, which is, there's an element of racism in there, but that's almost inevitable. Racists attach themselves to these nationalist movements, but they have putting together a very, very strong case for Germany leaving the European Union as well. So, in a way, Fran has been way ahead of the game, and it's an absolute indictment of the London media that none of Fran's work, as far as I know, ever appeared on any kind of media outlet in Britain at all, even though she's way ahead of them.
Yeah, she's way ahead of them. But because of the social media, she stayed way ahead of them, and she had more I wouldn't say the social media has yet to have an equivalent impact as the corporate media. We're just too small, but we're creating a critical mass of ideas that is breaking down their barricades.
Well, look, the crucial thing here, Susan, is that the young people don't use corporate media at all. I mean, certainly young people I know have got absolutely no interest in looking at the Guardian newspaper, for example.
Yes.
I mean, they may quote an article, they may read one specific article. The BBC is really despised by most young people. They get all their information, all their news from Facebook, Twitter, and all other sorts of social media. They're not interested in the corporate media. And in fact, if some big announcement is made on the corporate media, for most youngsters I know, they're I'm talking about sort of late teens, early 20s. Their attitude is, well, that must be the opposite of the truth. I think it's a little bit like the kind of what we were sold as the Soviet model of press. And I suppose the Anglo-Zionist criminal elite have failed so miserably in their foreign policy, in the military sphere and in the economic warfare sphere, that all they've got left is this 80% information warfare. That's the only thing they can do, is to try and take over our newsrooms, take over our production offices, control our commissioning editors, and they're bringing about this kind of cultural emptiness, which is almost all the time is just what they want us to think. And there is a certainly here in Britain, there is a very strong amongst I really don't know what it's like in the US, a real understanding of this amongst the youth, and that to me is one big hope in all of this.
Yeah, well, if they will participate and contribute, I think they have to in the future. I think we're heading. We are now the useless eaters, and we're assuming a powerful force of a wave of change and transformation. I think this is 2017 is going to be one of the most exciting years. We have 15 minutes left in the show. What are your projections for this coming year? Both in terms of Syria, in terms of false flags, in terms of terrorism, in terms of the stock market. What are you seeing happening in Europe? It used to be that you needed a false flag to change the dynamic of civil rights. Now there's so much, they have made so many fatal mistakes that have destabilized the society so much with real threats. Well, what do you think is going to happen now?
Well, big question, but I think one of the key things to look at is this whole Brexit process, and when the what they call the Article 50 letter goes in at the end of March, we could see some real shocks because the Anglo-Zionist criminal elite are absolutely livid with this whole process of Europe fragmenting, the fact that the people have decided that they're not in for this game, that they're playing with us. And a very, very strong message needs to be sent out around Europe from their point of view, that nobody else should be following the cheeky Brits in rejecting the wonders of Brussels. I mean, I think what we're dealing with in a way is a spiritual thing, Susan, that you've got a lot of people who have no, and I say, won't use this word lightly, but they just don't believe in God. You know, they don't believe that there's a purpose to all of this, and that somehow drives them to try and grab earthly power in one way or another, to feel important, to feel powerful over others. And that sort of has drawn a lot of people into power in Europe and the US and other places. Of course, it's a magnet to power, but it seems that they've actually managed to grab power here in Europe through the EU, etc. And there is the spiritual dimension I'm trying to point towards is to do with this whole sort of craving for meaning. For some people, that craving for meaning seems to come from power, and that's it. It's a complete obsession with power. The more power they've got, and it's not just, I mean, I think what happens is people start getting a lot of money, you know, they start piling up lots of properties, cars, you know, boats, that sort of thing. And then they realise what they really want is power. And so that, to me, explains quite a lot to do with the takeover of our politics, the political parties, the sorts of democratic institutions that might stand in the way of power, and also the media, because, of course, the media can humiliate these people. And one of the things I saw at the Bilderberg conference in Dresden through this organisation, I did a whole series, Bilderberg Exposed in Dresden, which is there on YouTube if people want to watch it. But there was one particular guy I met who was talking about nation-state bankruptcy. Now, this has all gone through, last year, has gone through the European Parliament, just totally unnoticed. The idea being that if a nation-state goes bankrupt, like Greece or whoever, that the assets of that state can be used to pay back the debt or whatever, you know. So this is bizarre that sovereignty, national sovereignty, might be breached by banks saying, actually, we're going to take over your civil service. We now control and own your civil service, your army, your police. But the legislation that's gone through the European Parliament was to make it absolutely clear that the banks have an absolute right over the civil service and over the army and over the police. So they can then basically bring in their people to run those things if the nation state itself goes bankrupt. So I think that's probably what they're going to go for in 2017, Susan. I think, you know, with a way of
there will be bail-ins. The banks will take precedence over everything, and seizing the money from the peoples will be the highest priority, no matter what the consequence. Yeah.
I mean, effectively, this is like money is the religion, you know. I mean, we mentioned God earlier, but, you know, there is this religion of money out there. It's pretty clear that for some people, all their values in life are built around how much money they can make out of every decision in their lives. You know, where they're going to buy something cheaply, even if it means it's sweatshop labour that's at the end of it. Some people have no choice over that. Others have more choice. But I think that's one of the things I'd say it could.
I predict that Donald Trump is going to change a lot for those people. That because he's not going to allow the I predict that Donald Trump is going to keep his promise to be more isolationist, non-interventionist. I think that there may have to be that they might be tempted to try a false flag in the United States, maybe targeting New York City, which is Trump's home base, trying to jar Trump away in the last desperate effort to force our world into war. But I will tell you that if there is a war, Europe will explode, and Europe will be flattened.
Yeah, certainly Germany will be flattened. I mean, you know, it seems to be the first line of, certainly in traditional Western Europe, where the Russians would be having to retaliate, because, of course, this is one of the things which was happening in the 1980s with the cruise missile program. Is all of us in Europe suddenly saw these US cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, running down the roads, and we were suddenly thinking, well, of course, we are now the target, aren't we? We're now the main
That's
target.
right.
So I would just point to potential financial collapse as being, and obviously there's with a financial collapse, there's a commensurate war. If there was a war too, at the same time, I would suggest the war would be probably just before the financial collapse, and you'd see the financial collapse being blamed on the war. So, obviously there's a potential there to say,
well, I think
dirty Russians.
I think it would be the exact opposite. I think the financial collapse would come first, and that then they would seize the financial collapse would come. They would seize the assets. They would immediately lock down the society and try to institute draconian civil rights controls to try to stop the people, and that would be the end. The deadly combination of the refugees, that are the migrants who've come in fighting for jobs, who've been getting all kinds of specialized preferential welfare benefits. There's always money to give them welfare. And then the regular people getting absolutely nothing and getting crushed. And then I think that the elite would see a true uprising that would be a bloodbath. And it would tear down everything. Europe, I think, but here's the thing. Thanks to Trump, I believe the United States will see that, and we will watch you go through that, and Trump will be fighting on our end not to let that happen here, and you will be the Europeans, not you, Tony, but the European leaders will be fighting to get us into their war because they're going to want us to protect them. But Trump will have learned all the lessons of the past of Pearl Harbor, et cetera, and all the false flags, which he's very well aware of. And he will be very leery, and he will do the smart thing and fight to the death not to go in there. He'll know that Americans don't want to fight in your war, and that that your side, the European leaders, will desperately try to pull us in, and Trump will put his and Trump will fight to the death not to do it.
Well, let's hope so. He's going to need to be pretty strong, pretty tough, because he'll be surrounded by people who'll be trying to bamboozle him to do the opposite, wherever it happens to be, so good luck to him. I mean, a lot of this is going to rely on mainstream media. I mean, I would just, alternative media, not mainstream media. A lot of it, following this is going to rely on alternative media. And I'd just like to say to your listeners, have a look at this. If you haven't seen it already, the Saker blog, which is based in Iceland. It's just saker.is, which is, I think, one
spell that again for me.
He's called the Saker. He's anonymous, but he's extremely bright, super brainy chap. And it's saker.is is the website. There's also another one called Strategic Culture, which seems to be pretty good. Many of these are from more of a sort of Russian perspective, and they're seeing Russia as the sense. But, I mean, that's perfectly reasonable. In the Middle East, the Russians have effectively, they've been a kind of de facto United Nations, making sure that although we've seen examples of regime change in other countries, that isn't allowed to happen, in Syria. And they've backed up the legitimate government. They've pointed out very clearly that the so-called rebels aren't rebels at all. They're just maniac terrorists who are sponsored from outside and trained by special forces from the NATO countries. And, so it's not surprising that you see the Russian perspective. And another thing, of course, is Russophobia. The Saker's done a really interesting article about the sort of paranoia about Russia that's been going for centuries, not starting even with Napoleon's attempt to take Moscow, going on and on and on. So I think this is another side which we're not getting at all in the mainstream press, is this kind of historical background to all of the things that are happening. So, we don't make the same mistakes again and again throughout history. That's why we read this history, is so we don't do it. My own research over the years, I mean, I point to a few historical things that I've done, which I think have fascinated me, and other people have enjoyed the research, is looking into the English Civil War, which was such an important event in world history, really introduced capitalism to the world. A great, city-states had been the norm for the merchant classes, for the capitalist classes. And then after the English Civil War and Cromwell and his chums, we had an English country, a whole country run by the merchant classes, having kicked the king out. my research has shown me that it was crucial to the Industrial Revolution that Cromwell was advancing the idea of enclosure, which was evicting people from the land and putting them into houses. And they called it agricultural improvement. It really was the agricultural revolution. But it meant that you had this massive pool of itinerant labour, people who were desperate for work. And then, of course, the factories were built for those people to work in, which was the Industrial Revolution. And that work on the English Civil War, I think, has shown Charles I, who had his head chopped off in 1649 at the end of the Civil War, as being actually, and Archbishop Laud, as being two amazing characters who were doing everything they could to stop these merchant classes taking over the country, which eventually they did. I mean, they brought back Charles II in the Restoration, and there was this amazing, like the 60s it was, 1960s, and this explosion in cultural freedom after the Puritans. And I would actually draw a parallel between the English Civil War Puritans under Cromwell and ISIS. I mean, they're this kind of maniacs
ISIS?
that just want to, because they were just trying to stop everything happening. Like they closed down all the theatres, closed down, stopping music, all this sort of thing going on in Britain. And so once Cromwell had gone, there was this amazing upswelling of cultural life and a great joy in the Restoration. There's all these famous Restoration comedies around. Which you can brilliant old plays, because that was what it was like. It was so awful under Cromwell, and we had a military dictatorship for 10 years here in Britain, and people were absolutely fed up with it. The control freaks of, from a Christian point of view, the Puritans were rather like ISIS from a Muslim point of view. So they were just trying to stop everything. They were also having the death penalty for all sorts of silly things, And so that research in the English Civil War is something which, I started my education on the Civil War actually on the ferry going over to Ireland, talking to an Irish farmer. He said, "Oh, did you know Cromwell did this? And did you know he did that?" And I thought, my God, this is such an important part of English history we don't get taught about at all in the English schools. So that's one bit of research. Another is that I did a lot of work on the railways, that is to say the close down of the railways here in Britain in the 1960s. And the going over to building motorways in the cars, rather like your freeways and the Nazi autobahns, and all the sort of forces behind that, which is led to the kind of crazy obsession with the car and obsession with oil that we've got today. Also, Operation Market Garden, that is the Battle of Arnhem in the Second World War. Looking at that and seeing how the Nazis had this massive wealth of gold in the Second World War. They realised they were about to lose it, and so they were doing deals with elements in the Allies. Obviously, there was the Operation Paperclip that was being planned at that point. These Nazis wanted safe passage, and they had a lot of gold to bribe their way to do that, and there were people who were prepared to cooperate and take that gold, including the Dulles brothers, of course. But not so well known is the collaboration with the Nazis of Winston Churchill's private secretary, Desmond Morton, Major Desmond Morton. He's a kind of Aleister Crowley-style character, and he was also involved in the First World War, working for General Haig in World War I as well. So Morton is a really interesting character to look at, and he was involved in snatching Hitler's treasurer, Martin Bormann, out, and that's when we also almost come full circle here, Susan, because that's what I was talking about this book OpJB about. OpJB stands for Operation James Bond, written by Christopher Crichton. That's his pen name because he was afraid he was going to be arrested under the Official Secrets Act for telling what really went on at the end of the Second World War. But he was a commando who was trained to, with a whole squad, go down into Berlin and snatch Martin Bormann out from Berlin, right from under the noses of the Russians as they were closing in at the end of the Second World War. Now, Bormann was a really important character. He had been working for the Allies really ever since the Falaise Gap battle just after D-Day, because Hitler had ordered what he called Operation Nero, which was to burn everything, basically, all the bridges, all the factories, all the towns, as the Nazis retreated through Europe. Bormann just completely ignored what Hitler had told him to do, because he was working with the Allies who wanted to take these factories over. They wanted to use this infrastructure. And so unbeknownst to Hitler, Bormann had completely gone against what he was saying. So he was a very important character. He also had all the keys to all the bank accounts. He knew where all the gold was in Argentina, in Switzerland, etc. And so they needed him over in Britain. And this book is a brilliant account of someone who actually went on that mission at the end of the Second World War. People may well doubt it, but there's been an immense attempt to cover it up, not least of which is this Grey Wolf book, which was put out as a spoiler, saying, oh, Hitler survived after the Second World War, blah, blah, blah. No, it was actually Bormann, his deputy, who was looked after by the Allies because he was such a valuable commodity in 1945 with all the keys to all the Nazi loot.
Do you think that Hitler did not survive?
No, I don't think he did. And this story has come out. This Grey Wolf book has been put out, I think, deliberately.
Yeah, I know about that one. The submarine, that he escaped on the submarine.
So cool. But it's put out to spoil the reality. It's a bit like on 9/11, we had all this thing about no planes at the Twin Towers, you know, the hologram and all that nonsense. Right. Yeah. What they do, I think, is, I mean, because the truth of the matter is it looks like there may have been no plane at the Pentagon. But what they do is they'll take that theory and they'll put it onto another part of the real story. So that's what's happened, I think, with Grey Wolf and the end of the Second World War, the Hitler bunker story, is that Bormann was taken out, not Hitler. Also, Hitler, you know, I think is quite clear. He was a busted flush by the end of the war. You know, he was, and Bormann was very much in charge at that point. You know, he was just directing things. But he's not talked about much, and it's very strong evidence that he was...
Everybody, I'm sorry, Tony, I have to interrupt you. We're at the end of our show. Tony Gosling, thank you so much for coming on today. This is always fascinating with you. You are fantastic. Tony is a former BBC reporter, and his friend Fran Anderson. Check out her PAX VISTA TV channel.
Can I plug my show? Thisweek.org. Thisweek.org.uk is our weekly politics show here in Bristol, the city that so-called discovered America.
Ha! Take care, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow.
Thanks, Susan.
Thank you.